I'm Nathan Cole, and today I'm featuring the most insane Karen deaths ever recorded. From a Karen so consumed by rage that she chased down a truck in negative 15-degree weather, to a Karen waging a one-woman war against her neighbor until an afternoon turned her final complaint into her last stand. It was August 15th, 2016, at a public marina in Erie, Pennsylvania. The morning was humid with the smell of diesel fuel and dead fish. Helen Garrison was 59 years old and had been dealing with her late husband's boat since his death. She never wanted to own one, but when her husband Robert died of a heart attack 2 years earlier, she inherited his 28-foot fishing vessel, along with monthly marina fees that kept draining her savings account. She had been trying to sell it ever since, but every potential buyer found something wrong with the engine, the hull, or the electronics. The marina was Robert's second home for 15 years. He knew every dock worker by name and always got slip B12, right near the main walkway. Helen felt she deserved the same respect, but the marina manager had other ideas. Temperatures reached 85 degrees Fahrenheit by 10 a.m. Helen arrived already frustrated after spending the previous night arguing with Robert's brother about whether to keep paying the insurance premiums. She marched straight to the dock office and demanded slip B12. The young dock worker, barely out of high school, explained that B12 was occupied and offered her C7 instead. Helen's voice carried across the water as she demanded to speak to the marina manager immediately. She insisted that as Robert's widow, she had inherited his status and deserved automatic priority over newer customers who didn't understand marina hierarchy. For 10 minutes, she paced the dock while other boat owners watched nervously. She made sure everyone within earshot knew that she would be contacting the local marina association about discriminatory treatment. Helen interrupted the dock worker repeatedly, declaring that she knew her rights as a paying customer and wouldn't be treated like some random walk-in. During her rant, she nearly tripped over a dock cleat while gesturing wildly. She also ignored a yellow warning sign about wet dock conditions that had been placed near the slip area after the morning cleaning. When a family with children walked past, she stopped them directly and demanded to know why unsupervised minors were allowed in what she called a professional maritime facility. The parents quickly gathered their children and hurried away from the confrontation. Marina docks become particularly dangerous when large vessels create wake conditions. The combination of moving boats and shifting water can cause vessels to move unpredictably, creating crush hazards for anyone standing between them. Around 10:30 a.m., a 45-foot cabin cruiser entered the marina channel moving faster than the posted 5-mile-per-hour speed limit. The wake from the large vessel spread outward in all directions, causing every boat in the marina to rock back and forth. Helen was making one final demand about getting slip B12 when the wake reached the dock area. She had stepped onto the narrow finger pier between two boats, leaning in and pointing aggressively at the premium location to emphasize her point about proper customer treatment. The dock worker shouted a warning, but Helen was too focused on her argument to pay attention. The wake hit the dock just as both boats began shifting inward. Helen turned toward the movement as the two hulls came together with tremendous force, crushing her instantly. Her scream was cut short as the boats ground together, trapping her body between them while other boaters watched in horror. Several witnesses saw the accident unfold. A man loading fishing gear onto his boat said he heard the impact from 50 feet away. A woman walking her dog on the marina path called 911 immediately. Helen died from massive crush injuries to her chest and abdomen. The coroner estimated she was trapped for less than 30 seconds before other boaters could push the vessels apart, but the damage was already done. The marina implemented new safety protocols requiring staff to establish barrier zones during vessel movements and prohibited pedestrians in active slip areas. Robert's brother sold the boat the following month without ever seeing it. The young dock worker quit 2 weeks later and never worked around water again. The investigation ruled Helen's death accidental due to unsafe positioning during vessel movement. No charges were filed against anyone involved. It was August 14th, 2017. The late afternoon heat hung over a regional amusement park outside Springfield, Missouri. The Sky Flyer tower rotated steadily above the midway, chairs tracing wide circles against a pale sky. From the ground, it looked controlled and ordinary. By sunset, one empty swing would still be turning slowly. Earlier that day, Deanna Price, 53, arrived at the park with two colleagues from the apartment complexes she managed. She had spent nearly 20 years in property management, handling lease disputes, maintenance complaints, and tenant conflicts. The role required firm rule enforcement, and she often approached disagreements as matters of authority. Friends described her as highly conscious of appearance and status. She documented issues carefully and rarely backed down, especially when others were watching. That afternoon, she joined the line for the Sky Flyer swing ride, a rotating tower attraction that lifted riders high above the park before spinning them in wide circles. As the line crawled forward, she began complaining loudly about delays and staff efficiency. When assigned to share a double-width swing chair with a teenage boy in a stained work shirt, she refused outright. She insisted on riding alone and argued with the operator about seating assignments, drawing attention from nearby guests. After verifying her weight met the single-rider allowance for the two-person chair, staff permitted her request. The lap bar was lowered and the seatbelt fastened. But witnesses later said she continued speaking sharply to the operator and gesturing downward as the ride began its ascent. It was about 88 degrees with a light breeze under 10 miles per hour, and the ride had cleared its routine inspection earlier that morning with no reported mechanical issues. As the swings lifted, Deanna adjusted a large handbag on her lap. Surveillance video shows her leaning forward before the ride reached full rotation. As speed increased, centrifugal force pushed the chairs outward. Readers were pressed back into their seats by the outward pull. Witnesses below observed her repeatedly reaching toward her waist area. At peak rotation, chairs extended at roughly a 35 to 40 degree angle from vertical. The outward force pressed riders firmly against the lap bar. Video later reviewed by park officials showed Deanna unclipping her secondary seatbelt while the ride was in motion. She appeared to reposition her bag and retrieve her phone. With the belt disengaged, only the lap bar remained as restraint. Seconds later, her body shifted forward. She leaned down and slightly to her left. The outward force kept the lap bar tight against her upper thighs, but her hips slid forward as her torso moved beyond the bar's centerline. The lap bar was not designed to restrain a rider who leaned forward beneath it. A nearby rider later stated he saw her legs extend downward unexpectedly. She slipped completely from the seat at an estimated height between 80 and 90 feet. The fall was captured on park CCTV from two angles. She struck a landscaped mulch area near a perimeter fence. The impact was head first, followed by her upper body collapsing onto the ground. The ride operator initiated an emergency stop, and emergency services were contacted immediately. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Deanna was unresponsive with severe head trauma and compromised breathing. Advanced life support was initiated on site before transport. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at a nearby hospital. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as multiple blunt force injuries from a high-elevation fall. The autopsy found severe skull fractures, traumatic brain injury, broken ribs, and internal bleeding, consistent with a head-first impact from significant height. Toxicology tests were negative for alcohol and drugs. Park investigators reviewed maintenance logs and surveillance footage. All mechanical systems functioned properly, and the lap bar showed no defect. Video confirmed the seatbelt was unlatched during operation. In the following weeks, the park implemented enhanced restraint checks and installed larger warning signs stating that removing restraints mid-ride can result in death. It was October 2016, and the suburbs of Delaware County, Pennsylvania were experiencing their usual fall construction season. Homeowners were rushing to complete outdoor projects before winter, and the sound of hammers and power tools echoed through residential neighborhoods as people added decks, sheds, and other improvements to their properties. Janice Greber was a 58-year-old insurance claims processor who'd lived in the same house for over 15 years. She worked from home most days, which gave her plenty of time to monitor everything happening in her neighborhood. Janice had always been meticulous about following rules and regulations, and she expected the same from everyone around her. When her next-door neighbor started building a large deck in his backyard that spring, Janice became convinced he was doing it without proper permits. What really bothers me about Janice's story is how a simple property dispute turned into a dangerous obsession. She'd called the township multiple times to report the construction, but officials told her the permits were in order. That wasn't good enough for Janice. She was absolutely certain they were wrong, and she was determined to prove it. She started taking photos of the construction from every angle, measuring distances from her own yard, and documenting what she believed were code violations. The deck was completed in late summer, but Janice's investigation was just getting started. She'd convinced herself that the foundation wasn't built to code and that the support beams were improperly spaced. The only way to prove it, she decided, was to get underneath the structure and take detailed measurements herself. So in early October, Janice began crawling under her neighbor's deck on a regular basis. And then this is the part where things get really disturbing. Janice made this a routine. Every few days, when her neighbor wasn't home, she'd squeeze through the gap between the deck and the ground to examine the construction from below. The space was cramped, filled with old construction debris, and definitely not designed for human access. But Janice was convinced she was gathering crucial evidence that would vindicate her complaints. During one of these unauthorized inspections in mid-October, Janice punctured her right hand on a rusty nail that was protruding from a piece of old lumber left under the deck. The wound was deep and jagged, exactly the kind of injury that requires immediate medical attention and a tetanus shot. But Janice was more concerned about explaining how she got the injury and admitting she'd been trespassing than she was about the cut. She cleaned it with water from a garden hose, wrapped it with a dirty cloth, and went home. Over the next week, Janice's hand became increasingly painful and stiff. She attributed the discomfort to stress from her ongoing battle with the neighbor and kept applying basic first aid. What she didn't realize was that the rusty nail had introduced tetanus bacteria into the wound through the deep puncture. By the time the characteristic jaw stiffness appeared 10 days later, the infection had already taken hold. Janice's condition deteriorated rapidly over the following days. The muscle spasms started in her jaw and neck, then spread throughout her body. Her family members noticed she was having trouble speaking and eating, but Janice insisted it was just tension from dealing with the permit situation. When the spasms became severe enough to affect her breathing, her sister finally convinced her to seek medical help. By the time Janice reached the emergency room, the tetanus infection had progressed too far for effective treatment. Despite aggressive medical intervention, including muscle relaxants and respiratory support, she died from respiratory failure caused by severe tetanus-induced muscle spasms. The medical examiner confirmed tetanus as the cause of death, with the puncture wound from the rusty nail identified as the source of infection. Janice's obsessive documentation of her neighbor's deck was found in her home office. Hundreds of photos, measurements, and notes that proved absolutely nothing. Township records confirmed that all permits for the deck construction had been properly obtained and that the work met all local building codes. The case was ruled an accidental death caused by tetanus infection resulting from an untreated puncture wound sustained during unauthorized entry onto private property. It was the evening of July 9th, 2017, in Charlotte, North Carolina. A warm Saturday, the kind where restaurants fill up early and stay busy well into the night. The commercial districts around the city were doing what they always did on a weekend: parking lots filling up, people moving in and out of restaurants, the usual rhythm of a summer evening. Patrice Hendro was 38 years old. She worked in client relations at a mid-sized logistics company, a job that required her to be personable and composed when it counted. By most accounts, she could manage that at work. Outside of it, though, Patrice had a reputation among people who knew her for being loud, combative, and nearly impossible to reason with once she had made up her mind. She took a particular kind of offense at unsolicited opinions, especially in public. Friends described her as someone who treated outside input as a personal challenge rather than something worth considering. That kind of personality is one I come across a lot in these stories, and it never gets easier to understand. Dining out seemed to bring that side of her out more than most situations. She had strong opinions about food, considered herself knowledgeable, and did not appreciate anyone suggesting otherwise. By the summer of 2017, her reputation at several restaurants in her area was well established among staff. She had complained loudly on multiple occasions, sent dishes back repeatedly, and on at least one occasion had gotten into a heated exchange with a manager that ended with her demanding a full refund for a meal she had already finished. Going out to eat was, for Patrice, rarely a quiet experience for anyone around her. On the evening of July 9th, she arrived at the restaurant alone at around 7:15 and was seated at a table near the center of the dining room. She ordered a shellfish dish that included clams and mussels, a house specialty, some of which appeared improperly prepared. When the plate arrived, a woman seated at the adjacent table noticed something was off almost immediately. Several of the shells had not fully opened, which is commonly considered unsafe and a sign that the shellfish should be discarded. The woman also noticed an odor from the plate that concerned her. She leaned over and quietly mentioned her concern to Patrice, keeping it brief and low enough that only Patrice could hear. That consideration was not returned. Patrice's reaction was immediate and loud. She told the woman to mind her own business, made a point of looking her up and down, and announced to the surrounding tables that she did not need a stranger telling her how to eat. The woman tried once more, gently, and Patrice cut her off entirely. People at nearby tables had gone quiet by that point. Rather than flag the concern with staff or set the dish aside, Patrice picked up her fork and finished the entire plate. Witnesses later described it as deliberate, like she was proving something to the room. And honestly, that is the detail that stays with me. Not just that she ignored the warning, but that she made a performance out of ignoring it. She left the restaurant that evening without any immediate symptoms, which is how these situations typically go. Bacterial illness from contaminated shellfish does not show up right away. Within about 18 hours, Patrice began experiencing severe gastrointestinal symptoms consistent with bacterial infection from contaminated shellfish. She did not seek any kind of medical attention at that stage, which was consistent with how she handled most things. By the following day, her condition had gotten considerably worse. She was running a high fever and was visibly declining. A family member who came to check on her made the call for help on the third day. By that point, there was little that could be done. Patrice Hendro died on July 12, 2017. The cause of death was septic shock, resulting from a severe bacterial infection that had progressed into the bloodstream, consistent with contaminated shellfish, which can become life-threatening in certain cases. The woman who had tried to warn her was identified and gave a statement to authorities. Two other diners who had been seated nearby corroborated her account. The restaurant underwent inspection and review by local health authorities following the incident. The case was closed shortly after. It was September 19, 2016, on a 4-lane commercial road in a suburb west of Chicago. Morning traffic was building as commuters moved through the corridor toward nearby office parks and shopping centers. Cars filled the curbside parking lane outside a strip of small businesses, leaving only tight spaces between vehicles. Patrice Holden was 48 years old and had lived in the area for more than a decade. She worked part-time in an office nearby and often stopped along the commercial strip in the mornings to grab coffee or pick up small items before work. According to neighbors, she reacted strongly to small disputes, especially when she felt other people were ignoring basic rules. Several people who knew her later told investigators that she frequently confronted drivers about how they parked around her car. At about 8:10 a.m., Patrice pulled into a curbside parking space in front of a convenience store, where she often stopped for coffee. The road carried steady morning traffic heading toward nearby office parks. She parked between two vehicles and remained inside her sedan with the engine running. A dark gray compact sedan soon pulled into the narrow space beside her. The 37-year-old driver parked within the painted lines and began stepping out of the vehicle. Patrice immediately leaned across her steering wheel and started shouting through her window that he had parked too close. Witnesses said the man initially tried to ignore the comments before briefly responding that he had parked within the lines. Patrice abruptly stepped out of her car. As the confrontation escalated, the driver returned to his seat and closed the door. Patrice walked to the front of the gray sedan and continued yelling while pointing toward the tight space between the vehicles. Several nearby drivers slowed down or turned their heads to watch the argument. She moved closer to the windshield. Witnesses later said she struck the glass with the flat of her hand and pounded on it several more times while the driver remained seated inside the vehicle. Patrice then turned back to her car, reached through the open door and grabbed a disposable coffee cup from the center console. She stepped back toward the gray sedan and splashed the contents across the windshield and driver's side window, with some of the liquid entering through the partially open window. Witnesses described the driver wiping his face and the inside of the glass. Patrice shouted several more comments before turning away. She got back into her own sedan and slammed the door for several seconds. Both vehicles remained where they were. Then the gray sedan's engine started. According to witnesses, the driver appeared visibly angry. Instead of pulling away normally, the sedan accelerated suddenly from the curb space. The front bumper struck the rear corner of Patrice's parked car. The contact occurred at an angle. Rather than sliding the vehicle sideways, the impact caused Patrice's sedan to pivot outward from the curb. The rear of her car swung into the traffic lane, while the front remained near the parking space. The movement placed the driver's side of her car partially into the right travel lane. At that moment, a fully loaded 10-wheel delivery truck was approaching in that lane at about 35 miles per hour. The truck driver saw the sedan rotate into the roadway only seconds before the collision. Witnesses later reported hearing the horn and the sound of heavy braking, but the distance was too short to stop. The truck struck the driver's side of Patrice's sedan with significant force. The impact crushed the side of the vehicle and pushed it several feet down the roadway before both vehicles came to a stop. Bystanders ran toward the wreckage almost immediately. Patrice remained inside the vehicle, which had sustained severe intrusion into the driver's compartment. Emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics arrived quickly and began emergency treatment before transporting her to a nearby trauma hospital. Despite rapid medical care, she did not survive the injuries sustained in the crash. The medical examiner later determined the cause of death was catastrophic blunt force trauma resulting from the side impact collision with the truck. Police interviewed witnesses and reviewed nearby surveillance footage that captured portions of the confrontation. Investigators determined the incident began as a roadside dispute over parking that escalated into a road rage encounter. Prosecutors later filed charges against the driver of the gray sedan that included aggravated battery with a vehicle and reckless homicide, based on the finding that he intentionally accelerated into Patrice's parked car. It was July 23, 2017, at a community aquatic center in Mesa, Arizona. The temperature had already hit 118 degrees Fahrenheit by 2 p.m., and the concrete pool deck was hot enough to burn bare feet. Sandra Mitchell was 51 years old and worked processing insurance claims after a shoulder injury ended her 15-year swimming coaching career. She was married with 2 teenage children who were embarrassed by her habit of correcting other people's behavior in public. The aquatic center remained her sanctuary, the one place where she still felt like an expert, much to her family's frustration. The pool was more crowded than usual because the community center's air conditioning had broken down, driving everyone to the water. Chlorine fumes hung thick in the motionless air. Parents packed the deck chairs while kids splashed in every available space. Sandra's prescription sunglasses kept fogging up in the humidity, forcing her to squint and adding to her irritation. She had already corrected 3 lifeguards on their technique and lectured a mother about proper swim diaper requirements. The mother had tried to explain that her child was potty trained, but Sandra insisted that pool regulations were non-negotiable, regardless of individual circumstances. Swimming had been Sandra's life for decades. She knew every safety rule by heart and had seen too many accidents caused by careless behavior. The pool deck was her biggest concern. Wet concrete plus running kids equaled disaster. Sandra had spent the first hour making her rounds like an unofficial supervisor. She approached a father teaching his young son to swim and informed him that his technique was wrong and potentially dangerous. When the man politely declined her advice, Sandra loudly announced that she had 15 years of coaching experience. She then confronted a group of preteen girls sitting on the pool edge with their feet in the water. Sandra explained that this violated safety protocols and demanded they move to designated seating areas. When a lifeguard took a brief break, Sandra approached the guard station and pointed out several safety violations she had observed, suggesting they needed additional training. Around 2:30 p.m., Sandra spotted a group of teenagers running along the pool's edge. They were playing some kind of tag game, laughing and chasing each other across the slippery surface. This was the final straw for Sandra's coaching instincts. She shouted that this was exactly how accidents happen. The teens ignored her completely, which only made her angrier. She had spent years teaching water safety, and these kids were treating the pool like a playground. Sandra stood up from her chair and started walking toward the teenagers. Her rubber-soled sandals squeaked on the wet concrete as she moved. She was focused entirely on stopping the dangerous behavior before someone got hurt. In her focus on the running teenagers, she forgot her own cardinal rule about pool deck safety. She was moving too fast on a slick surface while gesturing angrily at the kids. Near the deep end, someone had spilled sunscreen on the deck. The oily lotion mixed with pool water created an invisible slick spot. Sandra's foot hit the mixture just as she was pointing at the running teens and shouting about proper pool behavior. Sandra fell backward, first striking the sharp pool edge with her ribs before bouncing off and hitting the concrete deck with her head. She remained conscious but unable to move, lying motionless on the deck as lifeguards rushed toward her. Children began screaming as lifeguards cleared the area. Sandra showed signs of severe head trauma and struggled to breathe as help arrived. Lifeguards initiated emergency response procedures, but she remained unresponsive and showed signs of catastrophic brain injury. Sandra died from massive head trauma and internal bleeding as the horrified crowd gathered around her. The Aquatic Center installed non-slip coating on all deck surfaces within 6 months. They also doubled the number of safety signs around the pool area. A memorial plaque near the entrance later honored Sandra's 15 years of youth coaching, though it made no mention of how she died. The investigation determined the death was an accidental slip and fall. The facility was found not liable due to posted safety warnings and multiple witness accounts of the victim's unsafe behavior on the wet deck. It was May 3rd, 2014. In a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Marietta, Georgia, a fenced power substation stood behind new steel posts and clearly marked high-voltage warning signs. The recent security upgrade had drawn complaints for weeks. By late afternoon, damp grass still held rainwater from the night before, and several neighbors gathered along the perimeter sidewalk. At the center of the dispute was Cheryl Denton, 52. She had served 3 years on the Homeowners Association board and built her reputation on strict property standards and protecting resale values. Before retirement, she worked as an insurance claims adjuster, reviewing damage reports and disputing payouts. She relied heavily on documentation and formal complaints. Neighbors described her as persistent and confrontational during disputes, often escalating minor issues into formal challenges with local agencies. The fence she opposed was a commercial pulsed electric security fence rated for perimeter protection, similar to systems used at utility sites. It was not a steady current. Instead, it released brief, high-voltage pulses at set intervals, each lasting only fractions of a second, designed to discourage climbing or tampering. Under normal dry conditions, contact would cause intense pain and involuntary muscle contraction, but typically not sustained injury. The system depended on grounding. Electricity required a path through a body to the earth to complete a circuit. The fence displayed multiple danger high-voltage placards spaced every few feet along the wire. That afternoon, Cheryl attended a small gathering near the sidewalk bordering the facility. She had previously emailed and mailed formal complaints to the utility company demanding the removal of what she called an excessive measure. Heavy rain the previous night left the soil saturated, and shallow puddles remained along the fence line. The grass near the posts was visibly wet and flattened in places from foot traffic. She arrived carrying a standard metal bucket filled with tap water. Her stated purpose was to show that the fence would not cause harm. Several neighbors stood nearby, and a general phone recording occurred, though no clear video captured the exact electrical contact itself. The fence was active. Later inspection confirmed the energizer was functioning normally and had not been shut down. Cheryl removed her sandals and stepped directly onto the wet grass within a few feet of the lowest energized strand. She held the metal handle of the bucket with both hands. The ground beneath her bare feet was dark with moisture. She lifted the bucket and threw water toward the wire at about chest height. The water arced toward the wire as it left the bucket. Investigators later believed the wet stream and saturated ground likely created a conductive path during the next pulse, allowing current to pass through the metal handle, across her body, and into the soil. Her body stiffened immediately. Her shoulders drew upward and her back arched as muscles contracted involuntarily. The bucket dropped from her hands. She fell backward onto the wet grass and did not attempt to rise. The pulse ended almost instantly, but she remained motionless. Emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics arrived within minutes and began resuscitation efforts, including chest compressions and cardiac monitoring. Despite intervention, no sustained heart rhythm returned. Utility monitoring equipment recorded a brief ground fault at approximately the same time. Investigators later confirmed the fence system operated within manufacturer specifications and showed no malfunction. There was no evidence of prolonged entanglement or extended exposure to current. The county medical examiner determined the cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia triggered by electrical shock. In simple terms, the pulse disrupted the heart's electrical rhythm, causing it to stop beating effectively. Examination found small surface burns on her hands and the soles of her feet consistent with an electrical pathway, but no deep internal burning. The HOA board halted its formal objections to the fence. The utility company later held a public safety meeting explaining grounding, wet surface conductivity, and how pulsed perimeter systems function. Neighbor recordings were provided to investigators and reviewed as part of the final report. It was July 18, 2017, in Maricopa County, Arizona, the kind of place that doesn't apologize for its summers. That week had been sitting at or above 115 degrees for days straight, and the heat advisories had been consistent. Stay inside, stay hydrated, limit outdoor exposure to the early morning hours if you had to go out at all. Most people were listening. Ruth Ann Woolman was 62 years old and had been retired for about 3 years. She'd spent most of her working life as an administrative coordinator for a property management company. And when she moved into her corner house in a planned residential community, she brought that same energy with her, just without the paycheck or the authority. She had a clear sight line to 3 different streets from her front window, and she treated that view like a post. For 8 years, she'd been the self-appointed compliance officer for her homeowners association, measuring tape in her bag at all times, camera always charged, notebook always open. The HOA had a formal inspection process, scheduled walkthroughs, documented procedures, a committee that handled findings. Ruth Ann had been part of that committee for years, but by 2017, the other members had quietly started routing things around her after a series of complaints that went nowhere, and a few that had actually created legal headaches for the association. She hadn't been formally removed. She'd just been sidelined, and she knew it. That's the part I think matters here. What happened on July 18th wasn't random. It was a response to being told in so many ways that her input wasn't needed anymore. Earlier that week, a neighbor 2 doors down had submitted a self-reported lawn measurement to the HOA that Ruth Ann believed was inaccurate. She'd raised it with the committee. They reviewed it and closed it without action. That was apparently the last straw. On the morning of July 18th at just after 8 a.m., Ruth Ann left her house with her measuring tape, her clipboard, and her camera. The temperature was already pushing 97 degrees. She had told a neighbor the evening before that she was going to do a full street-by-street inspection herself since nobody else was going to do it right. The neighbor told her to wait until it cooled down. Ruth Ann said she'd be fine. She wasn't fine. She was out there for close to 4 hours. Neighbors saw her working her way down the block, crouching to measure grass height, photographing driveways, writing in her notebook. Multiple people came outside to check on her. One brought out a bottle of water. Another asked her to come in and sit in the air conditioning for a few minutes. She turned all of it down. By late morning, the temperature had crossed 112 degrees. Witnesses said she had slowed considerably. She was stopping more often, standing still with her hand on her knee, taking longer between properties. One neighbor who watched from her window said Ruth Ann looked like she was moving through something thick. She kept going. At approximately 12:20 p.m., a resident on the far end of the street found Ruth Ann on the ground in front of his mailbox. She was unresponsive. He called for emergency help immediately and stayed with her until responders arrived. Her skin was dry, which, in that kind of heat, is actually a bad sign. It means the body has stopped sweating, which means it's stopped trying to cool itself down. Responders worked on her at the scene. Her core temperature was recorded at 107 degrees. She did not recover. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as hyperthermia with severe dehydration as a contributing factor. Prolonged physical exertion in extreme heat without fluid intake. Her clipboard was recovered at the scene, still in her hand. The notes on it covered 11 properties. Of those 11, not a single one was actually in violation of HOA guidelines. The measurements she'd recorded were all within limits. No fault was assigned to any other party. Multiple witnesses confirmed that assistance had been offered and refused. The case was closed as an accidental death. The HOA formally suspended all non-emergency outdoor inspections during heat advisory periods in the weeks that followed. It was the morning of January 18, 2016, in Traverse City, Michigan, the kind of deep winter morning where the cold settles into everything and the landscape goes completely still. The lake country up in that part of Michigan gets serious winters, and January of 2016 was no exception. Sandra Pevlin was 47 years old. She lived in Nashville, Tennessee, and had driven up to northern Michigan alone for what she described to friends and family as a winter getaway. Sandra was self-employed, running a small interior decorating business that gave her enough flexibility to travel when she wanted. People who knew her personally described her as someone who was difficult to be around for extended periods. She had a tendency to talk over people, dismiss local knowledge as unsophisticated, and treat anyone she perceived as beneath her socially or professionally as someone whose input did not merit consideration. I've come across that type before in these stories, and there's usually a trail of small incidents behind them before anything serious happens. Sandra was no different. She had gotten into a heated exchange with a hotel clerk the morning before this incident over a room preference that had not been honored, and had spoken to the staff there in a way that other guests noticed and remembered. Trips like this one were something she took pride in, and she made a point of telling people she did not need guided tours or local recommendations to enjoy a place. She trusted her own judgment, full stop. Sandra arrived in Traverse City on January 16th and spent her first day and a half visiting shops and walking along the bay. On the morning of January 18th, she decided to visit a frozen lake on the rural outskirts of town that she had read about in a travel forum before the trip. She drove out alone, parked along the side of a gravel road, and made her way down a short embankment to the lake's edge. A local man in his late 50s was already there that morning. He had been ice fishing on the safer interior section of the lake since early morning and knew the ice conditions well. He had been coming to that lake every winter for over 2 decades. When he spotted Sandra moving toward the far left bank, he called out to her. That stretch of ice sat above a section where 2 underwater currents converged, which slows the freezing process significantly. The ice in that area had been measuring well below the 4-inch minimum considered safe for a single person on foot. He had checked it himself that morning and had stayed well away from it. He explained all of this to Sandra directly. She crossed her arms, looked at him for a moment, and told him the ice looked identical across the entire surface and that she had been on frozen lakes before. When he stepped closer and pointed specifically to the area she was heading toward, she raised her voice and told him she did not come all the way out there to be lectured by a stranger. She turned her back to him and stepped onto the ice. I think about that moment sometimes. Someone who drove hours to get somewhere, so certain of themselves that a 2-minute conversation with someone who knew that lake better than anyone was treated like an insult. She had walked approximately 28 feet from the bank when the ice gave way beneath her. The fisherman moved toward her immediately, staying to the thicker sections. A second man, who had been walking along the embankment above, came down when he heard the crack. The 2 of them attempted to reach Sandra using a rope the fisherman had with him. The opening in the ice was roughly 12 feet from where either of them could safely stand without risking breaking through themselves. They could not close that distance. And what gets me about that is those 2 men stayed and tried anyway, with what little they had. Sandra Pevlin was recovered from the lake later that afternoon. The cause of death was hypothermia. The fisherman and the man from the embankment both gave statements to authorities, and their accounts were consistent with one another. The case was closed not long after. It was June 3, 2015, on a quiet residential cul-de-sac in a suburb north of Dallas, Texas. By 8 a.m., humidity hung in the warm air as temperatures climbed toward a forecast high of 94 degrees Fahrenheit. A landscaping truck and equipment trailer sat parked along the curb while a crew prepared tools outside the neighboring house. Wanda Kohler was 55 years old and had lived on the cul-de-sac since 2001. She worked part-time as an office administrator 3 days a week. Neighbors knew her for filing frequent complaints about property issues in the subdivision. Records later showed she had filed about 30 complaints over 14 years, 11 of them involving the same neighboring family. The Reyes family had lived next door for 9 years. Wanda had reported them over issues such as mailbox color, trash bin placement, a basketball hoop left overnight in the driveway, and landscaping she believed violated subdivision rules. City inspectors visited the property twice after her calls, but both inspections found no violations. On the morning of June 3rd, a landscaping company arrived to remove a dead oak tree and spread gravel along the side yard. The work had been approved through the Homeowners Association several weeks earlier. Neighbor notification was not required. The crew arrived around 8:20 a.m. with a pickup truck pulling an enclosed equipment trailer carrying a skid steer and tools. The supervisor, Thomas, positioned the truck to back the trailer into the Reyes driveway. Wanda came outside a few minutes later. She wore a bathrobe and held a coffee mug. She walked directly into the street and told Thomas the trailer could not park there. She said the area behind her property line was her easement. Thomas explained the work had association approval and held up the paperwork. Wanda called the Homeowners Association office from her phone. The office did not open until 9 a.m. She then called the city code enforcement line and left a message. She stayed in the street arguing while the truck idled. After about 20 minutes, Thomas told her he needed the space behind the trailer cleared so he could back into the driveway. 2 crew members standing near the trailer repeated the instruction. Wanda did not move. She remained standing in the roadway near the rear corner of the trailer. Thomas began reversing slowly. The truck moved at low speed, later estimated at under 3 miles per hour. One worker on the passenger side shouted for Wanda to step aside. Another worker on the driver's side waved his arms and shouted the same warning. A neighbor watching from across the cul-de-sac also called out. From the driver's seat, Thomas was using his side mirrors to line up the trailer with the driveway opening. The ground directly behind the trailer frame was not visible from that angle. The trailer's rear steel crossmember struck Wanda across the lower back and hip. The impact pushed her forward onto the pavement as the trailer rolled about 18 inches before the driver felt resistance and stopped. Wanda was found behind the rear axle, conscious but in severe pain, as workers pulled her clear and called emergency services at 8:53 a.m. Paramedics arrived about 8 minutes later and rushed her to a nearby trauma hospital, but she died during surgery. The autopsy found a fractured pelvic ring and torn pelvic vessels that caused massive internal bleeding. The official cause of death was hemorrhagic shock caused by pelvic fracture and vascular injury. Police interviewed the driver and crew. A neighbor's security camera showed Wanda standing behind the trailer while workers shouted for her to move. Investigators determined the driver could not see directly behind the trailer during the maneuver. No charges were filed, and the landscaping work resumed the following week. It was a weekday afternoon in the fall of 2018 in a mid-sized city in Ohio. The neighborhood was a typical urban residential area, made up of older 3- to 4-story apartment buildings with shared hallways and rows of mailboxes near the entrances. One standard brick building sat along the block with a small parking lot in the back and a row of buzzers at the front door. Tamsin Brule was 38 years old and worked as a freelance data entry contractor. She worked from home most days and rarely left the apartment before noon. Her income was modest and inconsistent, and she had been in the same unit for just over 2 years. She was known among former co-workers as someone who kept detailed personal logs of perceived slights and was quick to escalate minor disagreements into formal disputes. She had contacted a tenant advocacy line twice in the prior year over issues that were ultimately found to be within her landlord's rights. She had sent formal written complaints about neighbors on at least 3 separate occasions. She was not someone who let things go easily. Her relationship with her landlord had been strained for several months over a single maintenance request she felt had been deliberately ignored. The The request involved a slow drain in the bathroom that she had reported in writing more than once. The landlord had acknowledged it but had not sent anyone to fix it. Tamsin had begun documenting every exchange in writing and had told a friend she intended to build a case against him. 3 weeks before her death, she had come across a warning in an online community forum about the dangers of mixing certain household cleaning products. She had commented under the post that the warning was overstated and that people were being dramatic about basic cleaning supplies. On the morning of the incident, her landlord sent a message notifying her of an unscheduled walkthrough scheduled for later that afternoon. Tamsin had told the same friend that if the landlord ever scheduled a walkthrough, she would take it as retaliation for her complaints. Her ex-husband was also coming by that same afternoon to collect a remaining box of his belongings. She had mentioned to a friend the previous week that she wanted the apartment to look a certain way before he arrived. She cleaned the main rooms first and moved to the bathroom last. The bathroom was a small enclosed space of roughly 35 square feet with a single window and an exhaust fan above the tub. Under the sink, she had several cleaning products, including a bleach-based spray and a separate ammonia-based floor cleaner. She applied both to the floor and tub surfaces within a short period and began scrubbing. The bathroom door was closed, the window was shut, the exhaust fan was not turned on. The combination of the two cleaners in the enclosed space began producing chloramine gas almost immediately. Chloramine is colorless and has a sharp chemical odor that can be mistaken for a strong cleaning smell. In a small enclosed bathroom with no ventilation, the concentration can rise quickly. Prolonged exposure in that environment can cause severe respiratory irritation, shortness of breath, and confusion. Based on the physical evidence and the confined layout of the room, investigators concluded she was exposed to the gas for a sustained period without ventilation. The bathroom door and window remained closed. Her ex-husband arrived that afternoon as planned. He knocked several times and received no answer. The front door was unlocked. He entered and noticed a strong chemical smell immediately upon stepping inside. The bathroom door was closed. He opened it and found her on the floor near the tub. Both cleaning product bottles were found open on the bathroom floor. The window was confirmed shut, and the exhaust fan was confirmed off at the time her ex-husband found her. The front door had been unlocked, consistent with his account of entering without a key. The landlord's walkthrough had not yet taken place. A determination was made that acute respiratory failure due to chemical inhalation was the cause of death. Investigators concluded that the chloramine gas produced by mixing the two cleaners in the unventilated space led to the fatal exposure. The manner was ruled accidental. The ex-husband cooperated fully and was eliminated as a person of interest the same day based on the physical evidence and corroborating accounts of his whereabouts earlier that afternoon. No fault was assigned to any other party. The case was closed. It was February 12, 2018, at a residential alley in Aurora, Illinois. The temperature had dropped to negative 15 degrees Fahrenheit with brutal wind chill that made the air feel like knives. Catherine Stone was 34 years old and worked as an environmental compliance officer for the city. She lived with her girlfriend Maria, who often complained about Catherine's obsessive recycling habits. Co-workers described her as extremely detail-oriented and passionate about environmental regulations, sometimes to an obsessive degree. She had a reputation for being inflexible about rules and procedures, often clashing with colleagues who took shortcuts. Her job as an environmental compliance officer felt like a mission. Every properly sorted recycling bin was a small victory against global destruction. Catherine believed that if everyone just followed the rules, the planet could be saved. That morning, Catherine was already running late for work. She had spent 20 minutes resorting her elderly neighbor's recycling bin, separating the plastics from the paper and removing items that didn't belong. She muttered about people who didn't care if the world burned while they slept. The sanitation truck arrived at 7:30 a.m., right on schedule. Catherine watched from her kitchen window as the crew began their route. Then she saw something that made her stomach drop. The workers were dumping recyclables directly into the same compartment as regular trash. Catherine appeared visibly upset. This was exactly the kind of system failure that kept her awake at night. She grabbed her phone to document the violation and rushed outside without putting on proper winter gear. The diesel engine rumbled loudly in the quiet neighborhood. Catherine's breath formed angry clouds as she confronted the crew. She shouted about destroying the entire recycling program and demanded they understand the environmental impact. Her voice became strained as she spoke. The workers tried to explain contamination rules. When recycling bins contain too much non-recyclable material, they have to treat the entire load as regular trash. But Catherine saw only willful destruction of everything she worked for. She pulled out her phone to photograph what she called illegal dumping for her official report. The crew supervisor tried to calm her down, but Catherine was beyond reasoning. She had seen the enemy, and it was wearing city uniforms. Sanitation trucks have significant blind spots, especially when backing up in residential areas. The combination of large mirrors covered in frost, engine noise, and early morning darkness creates dangerous conditions. Most truck-related pedestrian accidents occur when people position themselves in these blind zones during vehicle operations. The truck driver, an experienced operator, had limited visibility due to frost covering his mirrors. Catherine's winter coat blended into the gray morning light and drifting exhaust as frost clouded the truck's mirrors. When he started backing up to the next stop, he followed his normal routine of checking mirrors and listening for his crew. But Catherine had moved from the side of the alley into the narrow blind zone directly behind the truck, still documenting what she called illegal dumping and waving her arms to get the supervisor's attention. A neighbor across the street saw what was happening and screamed a warning, but the diesel engine drowned out her voice. Catherine never heard the backup beeper over her own yelling. She was focused entirely on confronting what she believed was the systematic destruction of the planet's future. The truck struck Catherine and dragged her several feet before the driver realized what had happened. Neighbors watched in horror as she screamed in pain while being pulled along the icy pavement. She drifted in and out of consciousness for several minutes, moaning as paramedics worked frantically to save her. Catherine died from massive internal trauma and multiple broken bones. Witnesses said she continued arguing about recycling procedures even as paramedics arrived. The sanitation company conducted a safety review and started retrofitting their trucks with backup cameras, beginning with the residential routes. The investigation closed the case as accidental death with no criminal charges. The driver was cleared due to limited visibility conditions and pedestrian error in a vehicle operation zone. It was November 22, 2018. Late afternoon at a commercial gym in Tampa, Florida, the weight floor was packed for the holiday rush. Music played, plates clanged, and phones recorded short clips. Within minutes, a routine lift would end with paramedics working beside a bench and a crowd pressed silent against mirrored walls. Sheila Moreno, 45, had already posted twice to her fitness page that day. She worked part-time as a dental office receptionist, but spent most of her time building an online following around heavy lifting and strict discipline. She often described herself as self-taught and rejected what she called unnecessary interference. Trainers at the gym knew her as consistent but argumentative, especially when corrected. She had previously pushed back when staff suggested lowering weight, using a spotter, or adjusting equipment, insisting she knew her limits better than anyone else. That evening, she claimed the Smith machine during peak hours and began setting up for another filmed lift. The Smith machine guided a bar straight up and down on steel rails and included adjustable safety pegs designed to catch the bar if a repetition failed. Witnesses saw her load multiple 45-pound plates on each side for a heavy set meant for video content. When a floor trainer pointed to the safety pegs and advised raising them closer to shoulder height, she responded sharply and waved him off, making it clear she did not want instruction. She left the pegs near their lowest setting, wiped the bar quickly. She left the pegs near their lowest setting, wiped the bar quickly, placed a flat bench underneath, and positioned herself for a behind-the-neck press without engaging the safeguards meant to prevent the bar from dropping onto her neck. The behind-the-neck press starts with the bar lowered behind the head, close to the upper spine, making it less stable than a standard overhead press and dependent on controlled grip and shoulder balance. Sheila had performed it before with lighter weight. This time, she added more plates than usual, She sat upright with her feet planted and her back against the bench, her phone mounted on a small tripod in front of her. The first repetition moved up steadily. On the second, the bar cleared the back of her head and reached near full extension. Sweat had built along her palms and across the knurled grip. As she lowered it for the third repetition, her right hand shifted slightly outward and the bar tilted. With the safety peg set too low to catch it at neck height, nothing interrupted its downward path. The bar struck the base of her neck and upper back with the full loaded weight. The impact forced her chin forward and drove her torso down against the bench. Witnesses nearby heard a sharp metallic crack followed by plates rattling against the rails. Her arms dropped immediately. The bar pressed her neck between steel and the bench edge, bending her forward at an unnatural angle. People nearby reacted within seconds, lifting the bar along the rails and moving the bench away. She remained motionless and not breathing. Emergency services were called immediately, and staff began CPR while an automated external defibrillator was applied. Paramedics arrived within minutes and continued advanced life support before transporting her to a nearby hospital. Hospital records in the autopsy determined that the bar fractured her cervical vertebrae in the upper spine. The break severely damaged the spinal cord. In simple terms, the injury interrupted the signals that control breathing and heartbeat. There were no signs of equipment failure. The cause of death was listed as cervical spine fracture with spinal cord injury due to accidental weightlifting trauma. The gym provided CCTV footage to investigators and reviewed its floor supervision policies. Management later required trainers to confirm safety stop placement before heavy lifts and posted clearer signage about assisted training and spotters. Her final recording remained on her phone. It was reviewed during the investigation and later incorporated into internal safety briefings as an example of how quickly a controlled lift can become fatal when safeguards are improperly set. It was March 14, 2016, in Clallam County, Washington. The kind of place where the tree line never really ends and the ground stays damp even in the middle of summer. Most people out there have a quiet appreciation for the land, and honestly, I get it. Maria Fentress had something closer to an obsession. Maria was 41, married, with 2 teenagers still in the house. She worked part-time doing bookkeeping for a local contracting firm. Nothing glamorous, but steady. The job paid the bills. What really occupied her time, though, was everything she'd decided to put into her body and everything she'd decided to keep out of it. Organic produce, homemade everything, zero processed food. That part wasn't unusual for the area. Plenty of people out there lived the same way. But Maria had a specific target by late 2015, and that target was tap water. She was convinced, genuinely, deeply convinced, that municipal water was doing more harm than good. Overtreated, chemically loaded, unfit for human consumption. She'd bring it up at neighborhood gatherings, hand out printed articles, work it into conversations that had nothing to do with water in the first place. And look, I'm not here to tell anyone what to drink, but there's a difference between being cautious and being certain. What pushed her over the edge, and I mean that almost literally, was when she started treating her tap water crusade like a public service. She wasn't just changing her own habits anymore. She was on a mission to convert people. Printed handouts at the grocery store, unsolicited water quality, lectures at school pickup. She had a whole binder, an actual binder, with tabs. Sometime in early 2016, she found a spring source about 2 miles out, off a rural access road cutting through a wooded area. Clear water running over rocks, cold, completely undisturbed looking. To Maria, it was exactly what she'd been looking for. She started hauling it back in jugs, first just for herself, then for her family, then for neighbors who were willing to take some. She talked about it the way people talk about a discovery they can't believe the rest of the world hasn't caught up to yet. By February, she had cut out everything else entirely. No tap, no filtered water, no bottled water. Just the spring. She was proud of that fact and made sure people knew it. When a neighbor suggested she get the water tested, Maria cut her off mid-sentence and said that was exactly the kind of fear-based thinking the water treatment industry depended on. And according to her, it was a question of whether people trusted corporations or had any common sense left at all. What nobody knew, including Maria, was that the water wasn't clean. The land surrounding that spring had significant animal activity, and runoff had introduced leptospira bacteria into the source. Leptospirosis isn't something most people can identify on sight because there's nothing to see. The water looks fine. It tastes fine. The infection it causes targets the kidneys and liver, and by the time symptoms show up clearly enough to raise alarms, it's often already progressed further than it should have. That's the part that gets me every time. There's no warning you'd actually notice. The first signs appeared in early March. Fever, body aches, fatigue. Maria told people it was just something going around, which, honestly, makes sense. Those early symptoms don't point anywhere specific. A lot of people would have assumed the same thing and waited it out, but by the second week her skin had yellowed, noticeably. She was exhausted in a way that sleep wasn't fixing. Her lower back had started hurting in a way she couldn't explain away. She showed up to a neighborhood meeting on March 12th, 2 days before she died. People there described her as visibly off, pale, moving slowly, not engaging the way she usually did. Someone asked if she was feeling okay. She said she was fine, a little too sharply, and steered the conversation back to the water, asking if anyone had actually looked at what they were drinking lately, or if they just trusted whatever came out of the tap. She'd brought a jug of it to share. Nobody took any. And I don't know if that detail is sad or just haunting, but it's stuck with me. She collapsed at home on the morning of March 14th. The county medical examiner confirmed leptospirosis, kidney and liver failure, caused by prolonged exposure to the contaminated spring she'd been drinking from exclusively for weeks. The source was tested shortly after and came back positive for the bacteria. It had been there the whole time. Every trip out to that access road, every jug she filled, every neighbor she tried to convince. No third-party fault was found. The spring had no owner. No one had flagged it before Maria started using it, so no warnings had ever been posted. The case was closed quietly. It was the afternoon of February 3rd, 2017, in Columbus, Ohio. Cold, gray, the kind of winter day where most people would rather stay indoors. The urgent care facilities around the city were seeing their usual seasonal foot traffic, coughs, fevers, the kind of minor complaints that pile up in February. Joelle Stamper was 52 years old. She worked as a supervisor at a retail distribution center on the west side of the city, a job she had held for nearly 9 years. People who worked under her described her as someone who ran a tight floor and expected things done her way, and that was fine in a workplace setting. The problem was that she carried that same energy into every other part of her life. She had a habit of treating anyone in a position of authority or expertise as someone to push back against rather than listen to, doctors especially. Joelle had a deep distrust of the medical system that went back years, and she made no effort to hide it. She believed she understood her own body better than any physician could, and she was vocal about that opinion to anyone who would listen. I've heard that reasoning before, and it always makes me wonder how much of it is genuine belief and how much of it is just fear dressed up as confidence. She had been diagnosed with high blood pressure several years earlier at a routine check. The physician recommended medication and regular monitoring. Joelle refused the medication outright, told the doctor she did not need it, and stopped going to follow-up appointments entirely. Her sister had raised the issue with her more than once over the years and had been shut down every time, sometimes harshly. That kind of dynamic where someone close keeps trying and keeps getting nowhere is something I find genuinely difficult to read about. In the weeks leading up to February 3rd, people close to Joelle noticed she was not quite herself. She had been having persistent headaches that she blamed on work stress and had mentioned her vision felt off on a couple of occasions. Her sister brought up getting checked out, and Joelle dismissed it. It was only after Joelle mentioned a pressure building behind her eyes one morning that her sister pushed hard enough to finally get her out the door. They arrived at a small urgent care facility on the north side of Columbus at around 1:40 in the afternoon. The attending physician conducted an initial assessment and measured Joelle's blood pressure. The reading came back at 210/120, a level that falls within hypertensive crisis range. At those numbers, the risk of stroke becomes immediate and serious. The physician told Joelle directly that her readings were dangerously high and that she needed to stay for further evaluation and treatment. What followed, according to her sister and the clinic staff, was Joelle at her worst. She told the physician he did not know what he was talking about, accused him of inflating her results to justify billing her insurance, and began speaking loudly enough that other people in the waiting area turned to look. When staff attempted to de-escalate, she turned on them as well. She refused every further suggestion, gathered her things with deliberate slowness as if to make a point, and walked out through the front entrance against the physician's direct and repeated instructions. Her sister tried to stop her. Joelle shrugged her off and kept walking. And then, if you can believe it, she made it maybe 30 feet into the parking lot before her body gave out completely. Witnesses outside saw her reach for her car door, hesitate briefly, then collapse before she could open it. She was unconscious before she hit the ground. Joelle Stamper was transported to a nearby hospital where she was later pronounced dead. The cause of death was a hemorrhagic stroke brought on by severe hypertension. Her sister and several clinic staff members witnessed the collapse and gave full statements to authorities. The physician's records from that afternoon, including the blood pressure reading, were part of the documentation. The case was reviewed and closed. It was February 22, 2018. Outside a busy bar in a suburb east of Sacramento, California. By late evening, the sidewalk patio was crowded with customers finishing drinks and talking under string lights near the entrance. Music from inside carried through the open doors while people moved between the bar and the outdoor tables. One of the customers outside that night was Marlene Group, 53. She worked from home doing data entry for an insurance company and spent most days inside, usually leaving the house only for errands. On some evenings, she visited neighborhood bars for a drink and conversation. Staff at this bar already recognized her. Over the previous year, employees had asked her several times to calm down or leave after arguments with other customers. Witnesses later described a pattern. Marlene often stood near groups she did not know, watching their conversations and commenting on their behavior even when she had not been invited into the discussion. Several patrons told investigators she had a habit of criticizing strangers for how they talked, drank, or used the crowded patio space, and she often refused to step away when asked. That evening, Marlene arrived shortly after 9:30 p.m. and ordered a drink at the bar. After finishing it, she stepped outside to the sidewalk patio where several groups of customers were standing around tall metal tables near the entrance steps. Among the customers on the patio was Divine Cerna, 28, who had stepped outside with friends to finish their drinks. Divine had some martial arts training and was standing with the group beside a tall patio table near the short concrete staircase that led down to the parking lot. Marlene moved close to their table and began commenting loudly about how crowded the patio area had become. Divine and her friends initially ignored the remarks, but Marlene remained nearby and continued directing comments toward them. Witnesses later said Marlene appeared irritated and was speaking louder as the conversation continued. Divine eventually asked her politely to give them some space so they could finish their drinks. Marlene did not move. Instead, she stepped closer to the table and continued arguing about people taking over the sidewalk. A bartender near the doorway noticed the tension but did not intervene immediately. Divine turned back toward the table and began gathering empty glasses to take inside. As she reached across the tabletop, her elbow brushed lightly against Marlene's forearm. Several witnesses later described the contact as accidental. Marlene reacted immediately. She pulled her arm back, raised her voice, and shoved Divine in the shoulder with both hands. Divine stepped backward to regain her balance. Witnesses said she raised her hands and told Marlene to stop touching her. Marlene continued shouting and moved forward again, pushing at Divine's shoulders while closing the distance between them. Divine stepped back a second time as Marlene kept advancing and yelling. At that point, Divine reacted defensively. She lifted her leg and delivered a quick kick to Marlene's upper chest to create distance as Marlene continued moving toward her. The kick pushed Marlene backward. She stumbled toward the entrance steps behind her and lost balance. Her heel slipped along the edge of the top concrete step, and her body dropped backward. The side of her head struck the corner of the stair with a sharp impact before the rest of her body collapsed onto the landing below. Several people nearby heard the sound of the impact. Witnesses said Marlene stopped moving immediately after the fall. Divine and several nearby customers rushed to her as someone called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within minutes and transported her to a nearby trauma hospital. but she died later that night despite emergency surgery. The medical examiner later determined that the fall had fractured the left temporal bone of her skull and torn an artery beneath it. Blood began collecting between the skull and the surface of the brain, forming an epidural hematoma that rapidly increased pressure inside the skull and disrupted the brain centers responsible for breathing and consciousness. The official cause of death was blunt force head trauma. Police later reviewed security footage from cameras outside the bar and interviewed multiple witnesses. Investigators determined that the confrontation escalated after Marlene shoved Divine during the argument. The kick occurred immediately afterward and caused Marlene to fall backward onto the concrete steps. Based on witness statements and video evidence, authorities concluded that Divine's action occurred as a defensive response to the shove. No criminal charges were filed. It was May 19, 2018, at a coastal trail overlook in Big Sur, California. The temperature was in the low 70s with light ocean breezes, creating perfect conditions for hiking and photography. Vivian Sterling was 38 years old and worked as a paralegal at a local law firm. She was married to David, who often apologized to neighbors for her confrontational behavior. She served on 3 neighborhood committees and had a reputation for filing more complaints with city authorities than anyone else in her district. Vivian had received an anonymous tip about illegal construction happening near the coastal preserve. Someone was allegedly building without proper permits in an environmentally sensitive area. She'd spent weeks researching property records and environmental regulations, building what she called an airtight case against the violators. The coastal trail was packed with tourists, but Vivian wasn't there for sightseeing. She carried a professional camera and a folder of property maps, determined to document what she believed was a clear violation of coastal protection laws. She had been hiking for nearly 2 hours, stopping frequently to check her maps and take reference photos. During her trek, Vivian confronted a family whose children were running off the designated trail, lecturing the parents about environmental damage and safety regulations. She also stopped a group of teenagers who were being too loud, explaining that this was a nature preserve requiring respectful behavior. When she encountered a dog owner whose pet was off-leash, Vivian demanded immediate compliance with leash laws and threatened to report the violation to park authorities. The owner quickly leashed the dog and moved away, but Vivian continued shouting about irresponsible pet ownership. The standard viewpoints didn't provide clear sightlines to the construction area. She needed definitive photographic proof to present to the Coastal Commission. The May weather was deceptively calm, but park rangers had posted multiple warnings about unstable cliff edges. Recent rains had eroded the sandstone formations, making areas that looked solid actually quite dangerous. Safety barriers marked the restricted zones. Around 3 p.m., she reached the main overlook where the construction site was partially visible in the distance. Vivian looked at the scene and appeared dissatisfied. The angle wasn't clear enough to definitively prove the violations. She needed a better vantage point to capture clear proof. The restricted area beyond the safety barriers offered a much clearer view of the suspected illegal construction. The cliff edge dropped 200 feet straight down to jagged rocks, where waves crashed constantly. Park rangers had specifically closed this section after recent ground surveys identified significant erosion hazards. Vivian studied her property maps and determined that the restricted area would provide the perfect angle to photograph the violations. She ducked under the safety rope while keeping her camera ready. Other hikers called out to her not to go beyond the barriers, but Vivian dismissed them as people who didn't understand the importance of environmental protection. The unstable ground beneath her boots shifted as she moved closer to the cliff edge. She was focused entirely on her camera viewfinder, adjusting her position to get the perfect shot of what she believed was illegal construction. Vivian announced to nearby hikers that she was gathering evidence to protect the coastline from illegal development. She took several steps closer to the edge to get a clearer shot of the construction site, ignoring the continued shouts from other hikers. The sandstone gave way without warning. Witnesses saw the ground collapse beneath her feet as she lost her balance. Her camera fell with her, capturing nothing but sky and rocks as both plummeted toward the ocean below. Multiple hikers called 911 immediately. Investigation later revealed that the suspected illegal construction was actually a permitted restoration project, clearly marked with proper signage that would have been visible from the legal viewing areas. Vivian died from multiple traumatic injuries after falling 200 feet onto the rocks below. Emergency responders recovered her body several days later when conditions permitted safe recovery operations. The Park Service installed additional barriers and expanded warning signage around restricted cliff areas. Warning signs now specifically mention that enforcement activities should be reported to proper authorities rather than investigated by civilians. The investigation closed the case as accidental death due to reckless behavior beyond safety barriers. Vivian's family chose not to pursue any legal action against the Park Service, acknowledging that she had deliberately ignored posted warnings. It was March 9, 2015. The elevated commuter rail platform in Brockton, Massachusetts appeared routine, but a stalled train and packed passengers had narrowed the safe space to inches. Maintenance crews worked near the edge, while overhead announcements repeated instructions that many ignored. Amid the delay stood Denise Harper, 54. She had worked 26 years as a municipal payroll clerk for the city of Brockton, processing checks for public works crews, clerks, and school staff. Her job required accuracy and strict adherence to timelines. Co-workers described her as organized, but easily irritated by disruptions. She frequently reminded others that her taxes funded public services and believed that entitled her to priority treatment when systems slowed down. That evening, as the train sat stalled, she grew visibly agitated. She paced near the yellow strip, complaining loudly about wasted time and mismanaged service. She pointed at the maintenance worker near the platform edge and demanded that the train move immediately, insisting the delay was unacceptable. The older Brockton platform, concrete surface, steel railings, and a narrow gap between train and edge became the focus of her frustration. Beneath removable steel plates were couplers and brake linkages that shifted slightly when trains restarted, tightening slack and moving cars forward by inches. The inbound train had paused for several minutes because of uneven brake pressure. A maintenance worker opened a small access panel near the platform edge to adjust a misaligned gap plate. Orange cones marked the inspection area, and repeated announcements instructed passengers to remain behind the yellow tactile strip until service resumed. Crowding intensified as another train waited behind. Denise moved closer to the platform edge, stating that the area was public space and that the worker should finish quickly. The technician directed her to step back while adjusting the plate. Instead, she stepped forward and placed one foot onto a temporary steel cover that had been laid over the open recess. Security review later confirmed the cover was not bolted down. It was intended to rest flat only while the train remained stationary. Denise shifted her weight onto it while angling her body toward the nearest door, positioning herself to board first once movement resumed. Air pressure returned to the brake system. When the engineer released the brakes, the cars rolled forward slightly to remove slack between couplers. That routine movement caused the gap plate assembly to shift. The loose cover beneath Denise's foot slid and tilted into the opening. Her right leg dropped suddenly into the narrow space between the platform and the train car. The train advanced only a short distance but carried significant mass. She lost balance and fell forward, her upper body striking the concrete platform edge as the steel side of the car pressed into her lower body. Nearby passengers pulled back as the movement occurred. A transit employee activated the emergency brake immediately. The train stopped within seconds, but the clearance between the car and platform remained limited. Her pelvis and abdomen were compressed between the platform edge and the rigid steel underframe of the car. Emergency services were contacted immediately. Fire and EMS units arrived within minutes, but access required stabilizing the car and creating space with hydraulic lifting tools. When responders reached her, she had no detectable breathing or pulse. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was massive blunt and compressive trauma to the pelvis and abdomen. In plain terms, the crushing force ruptured major blood vessels and damaged internal organs, leading to rapid internal bleeding. The report stated death would have occurred within minutes due to blood loss and traumatic shock. Investigators found no mechanical defect. Data logs showed the slight forward movement was part of normal brake reset procedures. The unsecured temporary cover and her position at the platform edge led to the fall. The death was ruled accidental. and transit officials reinforced safety boundaries during maintenance before reopening the platform the next morning. It was October 3, 2015, in Denton County, Texas, the kind of suburb where every strip mall looks the same and there's a gym on practically every other block. Nothing about the area stood out. Neither did Gail Pitsley, at least not at first. Gail was 38 years old and worked as an office administrator for a mid-sized logistics company. Monday through Friday, same desk, same hours. She was organized, punctual, and by most accounts easy enough to work with as long as things went her way. Outside of work, the gym was her thing, had been for years. She went 5 days a week without fail, and the tanning bed was as much a part of her routine as the elliptical. Maintaining her tan wasn't vanity to Gail, or at least that's not how she saw it. It was upkeep, part of the program, non-negotiable. The facility she used had a standard policy, 12 minutes per session, with a mandatory 24-hour gap between visits. Basic stuff, put in place to prevent the kind of cumulative skin damage that builds up faster than most people realize. Gail knew the policy. She just didn't think it applied to her. She complained about it regularly, to the front desk staff, to whoever was nearby, to people who hadn't asked. 12 minutes wasn't enough. The wait period was excessive. She'd been tanning for years and nothing bad had ever happened. So clearly she knew her own limits better than any laminated sign on a wall did. I mean, I've heard that logic before, and it never ends well. Staff had cut her session short on more than one occasion after she refused to come out on her own. There were documented complaints filed against her going back several months. At some point in late September 2015, she figured out that the facility's side entrance used a keypad code that hadn't been changed in over a year. She started letting herself in after closing. No staff, no timers, no one to tell her when she'd had enough. The access logs told most of the story afterward. She had entered after hours at least a dozen times across roughly 3 weeks, staying well beyond any duration a supervised session would have allowed. Some entries showed her inside for over an hour at a stretch. She wasn't testing boundaries. She had thrown them out entirely. The first sign that something was wrong came from her co-workers. Around mid-October, people at her office started noticing that her skin looked unusual, not tan, damaged. Red and uneven patches, peeling in others, with areas along her shoulders and forearms that looked raw and irritated. Gail brushed it off, said she'd just overdone it a little and that it would settle down on its own. She kept coming to work. She kept going to the gym, though there were no official tanning session records after the 3rd week of October, only keypad entry logs tied to her after-hours access. By late October, she had stopped showing up to the office entirely. A co-worker who called to check on her described her as sounding exhausted and difficult to follow in conversation. The skin damage had progressed significantly by that point. The burned areas across her back and shoulders had broken down into open wounds, and without any medical treatment, those wounds had become severely infected. Bacteria entering the bloodstream through compromised skin is one of the more straightforward paths to sepsis, and Gail had left that path wide open. For weeks, she was found unresponsive at her residence on October 24, 2015. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death as sepsis resulting from infected radiation burns across a significant portion of her upper body. The skin breakdown had been extensive enough that the infection spread quickly once it took hold, progressing to multi-organ failure before anyone knew how serious her condition had become. The facility's access records were reviewed as part of the process and confirmed the pattern of unauthorized after-hours entries. Every visit was logged with a timestamp. No fault was found on the part of the facility. The sessions Gail had complained about for months, the ones she called unreasonable and excessive, had been designed to prevent exactly what her autopsy described. The case was closed without further findings. It was the morning of March 14, 2016, in Dayton, Ohio. Overcast, cold, the kind of Tuesday where nothing about it stands out. People were heading to work, going through their routines. Nothing about that stretch of road suggested anything unusual was about to happen. Brenda Tullock was 44 years old. She worked as an office administrator at a property management firm about 3 blocks east of a large warehouse facility on the same road. People who worked with her would tell you she was capable at her job. Organized, sharp, got things done. But she was also the kind of person who had a hard time accepting that rules applied to her the same way they applied to everyone else. If there was a sign, she questioned whether it was necessary. If someone corrected her, she pushed back. Co-workers had learned over time that pointing anything out to Brenda usually made things worse, so most of them just stopped trying. That kind of attitude is exhausting to be around, honestly, and it followed her everywhere she went. There had been an incident the previous year where she had gotten into a prolonged argument with a building security officer over a parking validation policy she disagreed with, and had refused to leave the lobby until a manager came down to deal with her personally. That was the kind of thing Brenda did. For about 2 years leading up to that morning, Brenda had been cutting through the warehouse property on her walk from the parking structure to her office. It saved her maybe 4 minutes. The corridor she used had signage discouraging unauthorized foot traffic, but nobody had ever formally stopped her, and that was all Brenda needed to keep doing it. In her mind, she had been doing it long enough that it had become her route, something she was entitled to. March 14th started like any other morning as she parked, grabbed her bag, and headed toward the warehouse corridor around 8:20 a.m. Except that morning, there was a worker standing at the entrance. He was in his late 20s, and he was there specifically to keep people out. The corridor had been treated with a solvent-based industrial floor sealant the previous evening as part of a scheduled maintenance cycle. That type of product releases heavy vapors during and after application, and the manufacturer's guidelines required a minimum of 24 hours of active ventilation before the space could be safely re-entered. The ventilation system for that section of the warehouse happened to be offline for unrelated repairs, meaning the fumes had been accumulating overnight in a confined corridor with little to no airflow. The worker explained this to Brenda. He told her the corridor was closed, told her the air inside was not safe, and told her she needed to use the outer walkway instead. A second warehouse employee was standing nearby and heard the entire exchange. By their account, Brenda did not hesitate. She told the worker she had been walking through every morning for years and that no one had ever stopped her before. When he held his position and repeated the warning, she told him he had no authority over her, stepped around him, and walked into the corridor. He called after her, twice. She kept walking. She made it approximately 38 feet inside before her pace began to slow. Witnesses later described her appearing unsteady, reaching briefly toward the wall before she collapsed. The worker at the entrance did not see her go down immediately. It was the second employee who had followed at a distance out of concern who spotted her on the ground and raised the alarm. By the time anyone reached her, Brenda had been unconscious for several minutes inside a poorly ventilated enclosed corridor where solvent vapors had accumulated to high concentrations overnight. There was not a lot that could be done at that point. She was unresponsive when workers reached her, having already been exposed to a sustained concentration of toxic fumes. Brenda Tulloch was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was acute toxic inhalation. Both workers provided statements to authorities, and their accounts were consistent with one another. The corridor was sealed off, the facility was reviewed, and the case was closed. It was March 8, 2014, at a community farmers market in Tucson, Arizona. The morning was clear and cool, around 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Vendor stalls lined both sides of the main walkway, while customers moved steadily between tables selling produce, baked goods, and hot food. Near the center of the market, several food vendors prepared items on portable propane burners set on folding metal tables. Renee Cassell was 51 years old. She had left a county administrative job in 2012 after repeated disputes with coworkers. Since then, she had lived on a fixed income, while an alimony case moved slowly through family court. The weekend farmers market had become part of her routine. Vendors and regular visitors recognized her because she frequently confronted sellers about ingredients, food preparation, or what she described as the market's standards. Market staff later confirmed she had filed several written complaints about vendors during the previous year. One of the stalls operating that morning had been approved by the market committee 3 weeks earlier. It was a family-run stand selling pupusas, a thick corn tortilla filled with cheese and other ingredients, prepared on a flat griddle heated by propane burners. Beside the griddle sat a shallow steel pan of cooking oil used for frying certain fillings. Renee arrived at the market around 9:15 a.m., walking down the aisle while eating food she had purchased from another vendor earlier that morning. Witnesses said she moved directly toward the pupusa stall without stopping at other tables. She stepped past a small line of customers and immediately began speaking loudly about the stand, complaining that the vendor had not been properly reviewed. and that the smell of frying food did not belong at the market. While the vendors continued working and their adult daughter tried to respond, Renee repeatedly talked over her. As the argument grew louder, several customers stepped aside. A tray of sample pieces sat at the front of the cooking table. Renee reached across the counter and grabbed one. The vendor's daughter tried to explain the ingredients, but Renee continued criticizing the stall and talking over her while pointing toward the cooking equipment. Witnesses said she leaned over the counter toward the griddle and oil pan as she argued about how the food was being prepared. Several nearby customers told her to step back from the cooking area. Instead, she leaned even farther across the table. As she shifted her weight forward, her forearm struck the edge of the cooking table and pushed aside a tray near the burner. The movement caused the portable burner holding the steel oil pan to shift and tip forward. Oil heated to more than 350 degrees Fahrenheit spilled over the front of the table, splashing directly onto Renee's upper chest, neck, and face. Witnesses described her screaming immediately. Hot oil transfers heat quickly and continues burning as it clings to skin and clothing. Several people nearby stepped back as Renee stumbled away from the table. Oil had soaked into the front of her shirt and continued transferring heat through the fabric. She collapsed to the ground within seconds. Bystanders rushed forward as someone called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within minutes and transported Renee to a regional burn center. Despite treatment, she died later that evening. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was complications from severe thermal burns, an airway injury caused by the hot cooking oil. Investigators concluded the spill occurred after the portable burner and oil pan were knocked off balance during the confrontation. No criminal charges were filed. After the incident, market organizers introduced new safety rules requiring food stalls to place barriers between cooking equipment and customer areas to reduce the risk of similar accidents. It was the evening of January 14, 2015, in a remote area of northern Wisconsin. January temperatures in the region often fall into the single digits. The cabin sat miles from the nearest town, connected by unlit two-lane highways and narrow private roads cutting through dense forest. Marlene was 61 years old and had been retired for 3 years after a long career as a school librarian. She spent her winters splitting time between her apartment and a shared family cabin in the northern part of the state. She rarely drove in winter conditions and relied on other family members for most of the logistics during cabin trips. Within the family, she had a reputation for dominating group decisions and responding poorly when challenged. On previous visits, she had reorganized sleeping arrangements, kitchen storage, and common areas without asking, then treated objections as ingratitude. She had stopped speaking to a sibling for several months over a disagreement about shared furniture. People close to her described a pattern where she reframed losing an argument as choosing to disengage. She did not back down, and she did not turn back. On the second evening of the trip, a disagreement developed over sleeping arrangements that had been informally agreed upon before anyone arrived. The dispute involved Marlene and at least 2 of the 3 relatives present. It escalated over the course of about an hour. At one point, a relative told her directly that it was too cold to be outside without proper clothing and that she should calm down before doing something she couldn't take back. Marlene told him she didn't need to be managed. A few minutes later, another relative handed her coat to her and suggested she at least put it on. She pushed it back. She said she wasn't going anywhere, then walked out the door without it. The temperature that evening was 9 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind brought the effective temperature down to approximately -6 degrees Fahrenheit. The relatives assumed she had gone to sit in one of the 2 cars parked outside, which would have been the reasonable thing to do. No one went out immediately to check. When one relative did go out several minutes later, both cars were empty, and the exterior light showed her footprints in the packed snow leading away from the vehicles and down the cabin road toward the highway. The relatives went back inside for their coats and keys before driving out to look, which added more time before any active search began. By then, she had already reached the highway. Marlene had walked the full length of the cabin road and turned onto the highway shoulder. Investigators later reconstructed her path from physical evidence. Her footprints tracked along the shoulder for approximately 1/3 of a mile before veering from the packed surface into the looser drifted snow at the road's edge. The snow on the embankment showed a clear disturbance where she had descended the slope, disrupted crust, compressed drift, and a drag pattern consistent with someone lowering themselves to sit. She came to rest at the base of a guardrail post on the embankment below road level and out of sight from passing vehicles. She had no coat, no gloves, no hat, and was wearing the indoor shoes she had on during the argument. At 9 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill, exposed skin begins losing heat rapidly within minutes. She was found the following morning by a driver who had pulled over on the shoulder to check a loose item in the bed of his truck. He noticed her slumped against the guardrail post on the embankment below road level. She was unresponsive. She was approximately 0.4 miles from the cabin turnoff. The relatives confirmed the timeline, the warnings given, and the time she left. Their accounts matched the physical evidence, including her footprint trail and the disturbed snow on the embankment. The coat she refused was later found draped over a chair inside the cabin. Marlene was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was determined to be environmental exposure. The manner was ruled accidental. No other parties were found to have contributed to the circumstances of her death. The case was closed without further action against any individual. It was October 14th, 2015, at a weekend farmers market in Santa Rosa, California. The morning air was cool and dry, with temperatures in the mid-60s Fahrenheit. Clear skies and a seasonal harvest festival had drawn larger than usual crowds into the narrow walkways between vendor stalls. Eleanor Blackwood was 68 years old and recently retired after managing a high-end department store for more than 3 decades. In retirement, she stayed busy through her neighborhood association and a local consumer advocacy group, where she focused on what she described as protecting customers from unsafe or unethical business practices. Friends said Eleanor believed strongly in accountability, but often escalated minor issues into public confrontations. She arrived at the market carrying a folder of expired coupons and a handwritten notebook listing what she called common vendor violations. Eleanor had skipped breakfast that morning, intent on completing her inspection rounds before stopping to eat. By the time she entered the market, she was already irritable and vocal about what she viewed as poor crowd control and sloppy stall layouts. As the morning progressed, Eleanor confronted several vendors. She criticized labeling at a honey stand, challenged a produce seller about washing procedures, and demanded to speak with a market volunteer about stall spacing. Witnesses later said her tone was loud and dismissive, drawing attention as she moved through the crowd. Around 10:30 a.m., Eleanor approached an artisanal bakery stall operated by a young couple offering sourdough bread samples on toothpicks. Their setup included posted ingredient lists and standard food service tools. Eleanor immediately began questioning their sampling practices, arguing that portion sizes were inconsistent and wasteful. The vendors attempted to explain, but Eleanor continued lecturing them about consumer standards and efficiency. While speaking, Eleanor noticed several customers selecting larger samples. Hungry and still agitated, she took one of the thicker pieces herself, remarking that she would demonstrate the problem firsthand. She placed the sample into her mouth and continued talking without pausing to chew. The dense sourdough proved more difficult to swallow than expected. As Eleanor attempted to speak mid-bite, the bread lodged in her throat. She stopped talking abruptly and raised a hand to her neck. At first, nearby vendors assumed she was coughing, but within seconds it was clear she was in distress. Eleanor attempted to wave off assistance, shaking her head when the bakery staff asked if she needed help. She stepped backward into the aisle, clutching her throat as her breathing became strained. Several customers recognized the choking gesture and shouted for help. A retired paramedic in the crowd moved toward Eleanor and attempted to assist. Witnesses reported that Eleanor resisted briefly, pushing his hands away in apparent panic. Moments later, she lost strength and collapsed to the ground. Emergency responders were called immediately. Eleanor lost consciousness before paramedics arrived. Despite rapid intervention, she could not be revived. She was pronounced dead at the scene from airway obstruction caused by choking on a food sample. The market was temporarily shut down as authorities cleared the area. Many attendees were visibly shaken by how quickly the incident unfolded. The bakery vendors cooperated fully with investigators and were later cleared of any wrongdoing. The investigation determined Eleanor's death was accidental. Witness accounts confirmed that assistance had been offered promptly and that Eleanor initially declined help. No violations were found in the bakery's food handling practices, and no charges were filed. Eleanor's family requested privacy and declined public comment. The farmers market resumed operations the following weekend with no changes to sampling procedures, though vendors were reminded to monitor customer safety closely during crowded events. It was July 17, 2016. The northbound merge lane of Interstate 35 outside Round Rock, Texas, moved steadily under late afternoon heat. Traffic flowed at 65 to 70 miles per hour, with vehicles compressing and separating as drivers adjusted to merging lanes, blind spots, and shifting gaps in heavy summer congestion. Brenda Malloy, 48, drove a leased luxury SUV provided by her employer. She worked as a regional sales director for a medical supply company, managing contracts across Central Texas. Her job required firm negotiation and tight deadlines. Co-workers described her as efficient but quick to escalate complaints, often posting negative reviews to apply pressure. That afternoon, she left a drive-thru irritated that her latte was not hot enough. She demanded it be remade extra hot and watched the employee fill the cup nearly to the rim. The plastic lid pressed down unevenly along one side, but she drove off without checking it again. Northbound traffic tightened as vehicles merged from an entrance ramp. A gray sedan entered ahead of her and moved into the right lane with a turn signal. Brenda braked sharply, then accelerated to close the distance. Witness statements later described her riding the sedan's rear bumper and repeatedly sounding her horn. She kept shaking her head and pointing forward as if correcting the other driver's behavior. When the sedan held its lane and speed, she jerked the wheel and moved into the left lane to draw even with it. Traffic continued at around 68 miles per hour. Brenda paced the sedan, turning her head fully toward the driver and shouting across the lanes. She lowered her window halfway and leaned toward the opening. With the coffee cup in her right hand and her left hand tight on the steering wheel, she kept yelling, extending her arm toward the open air as cars moved past on both sides. She then snapped her arm outward and flung the cup. At highway speed, the airflow redirected the liquid instantly. Instead of reaching the sedan, the coffee blew straight back through her own window. A sheet of near-boiling liquid and the loosened plastic lid struck her face and upper chest. Her eyes clamped shut on reflex. Her right hand recoiled, and the cup hit the interior door panel before dropping into the footwell. The SUV began drifting left as steering pressure changed. A semi-truck hauling a box trailer occupied the adjacent lane. The SUV's front quarter panel made contact with the truck's rear tandem wheels. The impact forced the SUV sideways. Its momentum carried it toward the trailer's right side at an angle. The trailer was equipped with a federally required rear underride guard, but this collision occurred along the trailer's side, where side underride protection was limited. The upper edge of the SUV's cabin struck the underside of the trailer at windshield height. The roof structure collapsed backward under the force. The driver's side door frame compressed inward. Traffic camera footage and the rear dash cam confirmed the sequence unfolded in under 4 seconds. Emergency services were contacted immediately. The semi-truck driver slowed and pulled onto the shoulder. First responders from Williamson County arrived in approximately 9 minutes. They found the SUV wedged beneath the trailer's side. Fire crews stabilized the trailer and used hydraulic tools to access the driver compartment. Brenda showed no signs of life at the scene. The medical examiner documented extensive blunt force trauma to the head, neck, and upper chest. The impact fractured the cervical spine and caused severe brain injury. Death was attributed to injuries sustained in a motor vehicle collision. Superficial burns were present on her face and collarbone, but were not fatal. Police classified the crash as a road rage-related loss of vehicle control. No charges were filed against the truck driver. The dashcam video was later included in the investigative record. It was April 9, 2017, in Gwinnett County, Georgia. a busy stretch of suburban road where the morning commute backed up without fail and pedestrian crossings were more suggestion than structure. The intersection at the center of this story sat between a residential block and a commercial strip, and it moved a steady volume of traffic from the moment the sun came up. Cheryl Cruthers was 54 years old and had lived 2 blocks from that intersection for 11 years. She had retired from a long career in office management and spent most of her time at home, which meant she had more hours in the day than most people to notice things that bothered her. And that intersection bothered her enormously. She had filed complaints with local traffic authorities on multiple occasions about the signal timing, about drivers running the light, about pedestrians nearly getting clipped in the crosswalk. A few of those complaints got acknowledgement letters. None of them got action, at least not fast enough for Cheryl. Her neighbors knew her as someone who cared deeply about the neighborhood and had very little patience for anyone who didn't share that level of care. She was vocal, persistent, and not particularly interested in being told that something was outside her control. When the official channels stopped producing results, Cheryl decided to produce her own. You know what I find fascinating about people like Cheryl? They always think they're the solution to problems that nobody asked them to solve. Sometime in late March 2017, she began stationing herself at the intersection during the morning rush. No vest, no official designation, nothing beyond her own certainty that she knew how traffic should move. She would step into the road to wave pedestrians through, hold up a hand to stop turning vehicles, and position herself in the middle of the crosswalk like she had every authority in the world to be there. She did this every weekday morning for roughly 2 weeks. A few had told her directly that she was going to get herself hurt. Cheryl's response, by multiple accounts, was that somebody had to do it. Can you imagine being so convinced you're right that you'd literally stand in traffic to prove it? By the second week, her presence at the intersection had become predictable enough that some drivers expected her and slowed down accordingly. That predictability, as it turned out, worked against her. On the morning of April 9th, the commute was moving the way it usually did. Steady flow. No major backups yet. Cheryl was in her usual spot near the crosswalk, managing pedestrians the way she had been for days. At approximately 7:40 a.m., she stepped beyond the marked crosswalk and into the outer travel lane to stop a right-turning vehicle, which was something witnesses had seen her do before. What she didn't account for was a second vehicle coming through the intersection from the opposite direction at the same moment. The driver had a green light and no reason to expect a pedestrian in that part of the road. By the time Cheryl moved into that lane, she was less than 2 car lengths away. The driver braked but didn't have enough distance. The impact was at reduced speed but still fatal. Cheryl was disastrous, struck on her left side, and went down immediately. Several commuters who witnessed the collision pulled over. One stayed with her until emergency personnel arrived. The driver remained at the scene and was visibly shaken. Witnesses were consistent in their accounts. Cheryl had stepped into the path of oncoming traffic while attempting to direct a separate vehicle. Cheryl Cruthers was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as blunt force trauma resulting in internal hemorrhaging, consistent with a vehicle strike at low to moderate speed. The responding authorities reviewed witness statements and traffic camera footage from a nearby commercial property. The footage confirmed what witnesses had already described. The driver was not charged. The investigation closed within weeks, with the determination that Cheryl had placed herself in the path of a vehicle operating lawfully within the intersection. No traffic authority had sanctioned her presence there at any point. Her complaints about the intersection, the ones she had been filing for years, were found on record. The signal timing was reviewed shortly after her death. Adjustments were made the following month. It was the night of October 4th, 2017, in Memphis, Tennessee. A Wednesday, quiet for the most part, the kind of weeknight where most people had already settled in for the evening. The commercial area on the south side of the city was mostly empty by that hour, a stretch of parking lots and low-rise retail buildings with only scattered foot traffic. Trina Offit was 41 years old. She worked part-time at a shipping and packaging store on the east side of Memphis and lived alone in a rental house about 2 miles from where this incident took place. People who knew Trina described her as someone who held on to grievances longer than most and had a pattern of acting on them in ways that other people found alarming. She had a history of property disputes with neighbors that had escalated on more than one occasion, and there had been at least 2 prior incidents where she had been identified as the person responsible for damage to vehicles belonging to people she had conflicts with. She had also been removed from a local community meeting the year prior after refusing to stop speaking over other attendees and threatening to report the organizers for what she described as discrimination against her. What strikes me about people like Trina is that the pattern is always there well before anything serious happens. It rarely comes out of nowhere. She had a specific grievance against the owner of a silver sedan she had seen parked in a lot she used during work hours. The owner of the vehicle had no connection to Trina personally. She had convinced herself over several days that the car's presence was a deliberate slight, and on the night of October 4th, she decided to act on it. She arrived at the parking lot on foot at around 10:45 in the evening carrying a backpack. She pulled out a can of spray paint and began covering the silver sedan in large painted markings across the hood, doors, and rear panel. A security guard who was doing a routine patrol of the adjoining lot spotted her within a few minutes. He approached and told her directly that she needed to stop and leave the area immediately. He explained that the lot and the surrounding block were within the perimeter of an active police situation. Earlier that evening, an armed robbery had taken place at a small convenience store at the end of the block. The suspect had fled on foot and had not yet been located. Law enforcement was still active in the surrounding area, with officers canvassing nearby streets. Trina did not stop. She told the guard to leave her alone, turned back to the car, and kept going. The guard warned her a second time, more urgently, telling her that staying in that lot was putting her in immediate danger. She turned to face him, raised her voice, and told him he had no authority over her and that she would leave when she was finished. Then she reached for a second can of spray paint and continued. Honestly, the deliberateness of that, reaching for the second can after being warned twice, is the detail that stands out most to me in this one. The guard stepped back and attempted to reach law enforcement by radio. I think about what those few seconds must have felt like for him, standing there, having said everything he could say, watching someone refuse to move. That kind of helplessness is something I don't think I could easily shake. That was when the shots were fired. The suspect, who had been concealed between 2 parked vehicles further along the same lot, fired after realizing he had been spotted. Trina was struck once in the chest. She went down next to the vehicle she had been painting. The guard, who had moved behind a concrete barrier when he heard the shots, was unharmed. Multiple people in the surrounding area heard the gunfire and contacted authorities. Trina Offutt was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was a single gunshot wound to the chest. The suspect was located and apprehended within the same block less than an hour later. The security guard provided a full statement to authorities. The case was reviewed and closed. It was July 11th, 2017, in a residential neighborhood in Scottsdale, Arizona. An excessive heat warning had been issued that morning. By early afternoon, temperatures were expected to reach about 114 degrees Fahrenheit. Streets were quiet, as most residents stayed indoors. In direct sun, the dark asphalt driveways and roads had already begun heating far above the air temperature. Gloria Finch was 58 years old and had lived in the same house for 19 years. She bought it with her husband in 1998. After their divorce in 2011, she remained there alone. Gloria worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a local heating and air company. In early 2016, the house next door was converted into a short-term rental property. Gloria strongly opposed the change. Over the next year and a half, she filed complaints with the city zoning office, her homeowners association, the rental listing service, and the state consumer complaint office. Records later showed 14 formal complaints, all closed without finding a violation. Neighbors said Gloria sometimes confronted guests when they arrived. On 2 occasions, visitors called police to report arguments in the driveway. Officers documented the encounters, but no enforcement action followed. Gloria kept copies of her complaints in a folder. On July 11th, local news stations repeated the heat advisory throughout the day. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had reached about 114 degrees Fahrenheit, according to nearby weather stations. At 1:48 p.m., a rideshare vehicle stopped in front of the rental house. 5 women visiting from Denver stepped out with luggage for a weekend trip. Gloria came out of her front door before they reached the walkway. Holding her folder, she walked directly into the driveway and stood between the group and the front path. She told them the property was operating illegally and said they should not enter. The rideshare driver confirmed the address on his phone and left after completing the drop-off. The visitors began pulling suitcases from the sidewalk. Gloria stepped forward again, blocking the path to the entry. One of the guests, who later told police she was a nurse, suggested moving the conversation to the shaded porch and offered her a bottle of water, but Gloria declined. The discussion continued in the open driveway under direct sunlight. The guests spoke calmly and asked questions about the complaints she mentioned, while Gloria continued explaining why she believed the property violated local rules. Around 2:20 p.m., another guest again offered water and suggested stepping into the shade near the covered entryway. Gloria declined a second time and remained standing on the asphalt driveway. By 2:30 p.m., she had been in direct sunlight for more than 40 minutes. Witnesses said her speech became repetitive as she continued arguing about zoning complaints. At 2:39 p.m., Gloria stopped mid-sentence and appeared unsteady. Her knees bent and she dropped into a seated position on the driveway without bracing herself. One of the visitors, a nurse, moved to her immediately. Gloria's skin felt extremely hot and her breathing was shallow. Her eyes were open but unfocused, and she did not respond clearly when spoken to. The nurse called emergency services. Responders arrived at 2:47 p.m. and found Gloria confused and disoriented. Paramedics measured her core temperature at about 107.4 degrees Fahrenheit and began emergency cooling. She was transported to a nearby regional hospital. Despite aggressive treatment, her condition worsened over the next several hours. Medical records later showed signs of organ damage consistent with severe heat stroke, including kidney failure, liver injury, and abnormal blood clotting. Gloria died later that evening. The medical examiner concluded that her death was caused by hyperthermia due to environmental heat exposure. The examination documented extensive heat-related damage across multiple organs. Police documented the incident and filed no charges. Witness statements confirmed that Gloria had remained in direct sunlight during the confrontation and had declined several offers of water and shade before she collapsed. It was a weekday morning in the spring of 2016 in a residential neighborhood in Sacramento, California. The narrow two-lane street had a noticeable downhill grade, with posted signs reminding drivers to turn their wheels into the curb when parking. Deborah Kozlow was 54 years old and worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a small family-owned business. She kept a consistent daily routine, running errands in the same general area most weekday mornings before going in for her afternoon shift. She had driven the same routes through that neighborhood for years and was familiar with nearly every block. People who knew her described her as someone who treated every minor dispute as a matter of principle rather than convenience, and who did not respond well to being corrected by anyone she considered to be in a position of minor authority. She had contested parking citations on at least 4 separate occasions in the 2 years prior. On one occasion, she had followed a meter maid to their next stop on the same street to continue an argument that had already been resolved against her. She was known among neighbors for sending group emails about parking violations on their block and had once demanded written justification from a parking enforcement officer for a citation she had received years earlier. On the morning of the incident, Deborah parked her 1998 Honda Accord on the downhill side of the street, which had an approximately 8% grade, to drop off a document at a neighbor's house. She left the car in park but did not turn the front wheels into the curb, violating posted parking rules, a habit she had maintained for years. A meter maid was already writing a citation when she returned minutes later. Deborah approached immediately and began contesting the citation on the spot. The meter maid pointed to the posted sign and indicated the wheels were not turned into the curb. Deborah disagreed and stated she had parked on that street many times without issue. The exchange continued for several minutes without resolution. Neither party moved from the spot. As the conversation continued, Deborah reached back into the open driver's side door and leaned across toward the passenger seat where the folder was sitting. While leaning across the seat, her weight shifted onto the door frame and seat edge. Investigators determined the transmission had not been fully engaged in park when she exited the vehicle, leaving the parking mechanism only partially seated. The shift in her weight altered the load on the drivetrain, allowing the partially engaged parking mechanism to slip free. The car began rolling backward down the grade. Deborah was still partially inside the doorframe when the vehicle started moving. Her body weight was distributed between the doorframe and the seat, which made it difficult to push herself clear quickly. The meter maid's vehicle was parked about 15 feet behind Deborah's car. On the 8% grade, the rollback covered that distance in roughly 3 to 4 seconds. Deborah was still partially inside the doorframe and could not pull clear before her rear bumper struck the front of the meter maid's vehicle, pinning her at the hip and lower torso and causing fatal internal injuries. The meter maid was standing approximately 6 feet to the side at the moment the car began moving and witnessed the entire sequence from start to finish. 2 residents on the sidewalk across the street also observed the rollback and collision. All 3 accounts were consistent on every key detail. Deborah was pronounced dead at the scene. The transmission was found disengaged from park, and the folder she had been reaching for was open on the passenger seat. The front wheels were still pointing straight, consistent with witness accounts. The death was ruled accidental, and the case was closed without further action.